Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. Come, thou long expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let us find our rest in thee. Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing. Joy to the earth, the Savior reigns. Let men their songs imply, while fields and floods, rocks, hills, and plains repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy, repeat, repeat the sounding joy. No more let sins and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found. And he rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders, wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders, wonders of his love.
Thank you, Randy. Go ahead and take a seat. We're going to do today just a little bit different, which is okay. It's good to see you guys. How are you guys doing? It's good to see you gals, too. Love the English language. Few announcements for you real quick. 17 and older, join us at the River Monday, 7 to 8:30. That'll be tomorrow. Everyone join us at the Well this Thursday from 5:30 to 7:30. We're going to go over chapter 7 this week because last week we had a snowstorm. Missions 2025, Eastern Tennessee, January 7th through the 12th. Building projects, $300 a person. Talk to Jonathan over there. We would like to know sooner than later if you're planning on going so that we can make the proper logistics. I'll give you a date probably this week on when we need an answer by. Also pick up Lost and Found around the corner over there in the back. What we'll end up doing is after church today, since you guys have had a few weeks to get Lost and Found, anything that is not picked up after church today becomes your kid's next Christmas present. As in it's free before I donate it to somebody else. Also, just want to highlight Jonathan, Johanna, Helen, Carla, Rob, Megan, Denise, Crystal. Thank you so much for all that you guys did to invest in us yesterday. It was a lot of fun for those that made it. Thank you. Want to talk real quick about my time in the Bering Sea. Sometimes God sends you out of a community to transform you. Like Jesus did that often. Like he sent out the disciples in pairs, right? And they had this experience with God and with their community, and they came back changed men, right? Sometimes he does that. When I was on the Bering Sea, I was on this island in the middle of nowhere, right? There's 452 people at that time. I don't know how many there are today. But when you know the exact number of the people that are on the island, you know that it's a small island. Right? The most beautiful gift of being on that island for the people there is that everybody almost knew you. Right? Like a community that actually knows you for generations is both the most beautiful gift and the most terrifying. Right? Because that was also the hardest thing about the island is that everybody knew you. And they knew your parents. Talk about generational stuff, especially with darkness. Man, try to outrun your parents' or your grandparents' legacy, especially when they screwed up, right? There was a whole lot of darkness that was on that island. It was hard, right? And so when I was there, there's a number of lessons that God taught me. And one of them was that things were a little bit different there. Like, even when you take a look at, like, the standardized tests, kids did terrible at some of these standardized tests. Was it because that they were not smart? No, right? Some of them, it's like, questions like, what sound does a dog make for kindergartners, right? And it's like, bow wow, rough. You know, like, meow, they speak English. And they're like, oh, they speak English, obviously. You're like, no, dogs don't speak English, but the only concept that they had of a dog was from cartoons that all spoke English, right? You're like, oh, that's kind of weird. What did they know about? Well, what is the worst predator known to mankind, right? Give me some guesses. What's the worst predator? Polar bear. Well, they actually did have polar bears come on the island sometimes, but even the polar bears that came on the island sometimes were not the biggest predator. Rats. Because rats would eat the eggs from all these seabirds, and without eggs, you don't have foxes, you don't have reindeer, you don't have anything else. The whole ecosystem comes down if there's rats. Literally, anytime that they found on the boat a rat, they would kill it, and they would make decals of, like, killed another rat. And it was like this thing of, like, I've killed 7 rats. I made sure that 7 rats didn't come on this island, right? It's just a different way of life. There's things that they know that we don't know. Like, you talk about insects. These kids had never seen insects in their entire life. Why? You're living on an island in the Bering Sea that's so frozen and like 45-mile-an-hour winds, there's no insects that can live out there. You think you're afraid of spiders? These people, at some point in time in their life, would leave this area, this island. It was 48 square miles. They lived on 2 square miles. 2 square miles. Think about that. Like, the population of this entire island lived between here and McDonald's. And actually quite a bit closer than that. That's a small area, right? They lived in this small, tight area. And almost all of them at some point in their life would leave the island. And they would go to the big, big city of Anchorage. right? They would run from the thing that like, man, life is so small here. We can't do it. Man, I just want to see the world. I want to get out of this place. I've had this darkness thing that's gone on. Like everybody knows my business. Everybody's up in my business. I just want to go and be free. And they went and they'd be free. They checked out this Anchorage thing. And you know what happens in life is at some point in time, you go through hard things. If you have gone through hard things here, put up your hand. Those that don't have your hand up, good luck. You're going to go through hard things. Those of you that had your hand up, don't smirk. You're going to go through more hard things. It happens. It's life, right? Is God trying to punish you for going through hard things? No, it's part of life. There's hard things. But sometimes these people would leave the island and do one of two things. First one, oh man, I loved it. There's people like Mac and Edna. I honor you guys today because they went out and they said, man, I know who I am and I have a purpose. And I need to learn X, Y, and Z. And I need to bring the things that I know back home to the culture before my culture dies. And I need to invest in other kids that are not my own because my island needs truth. My island needs light. My island needs stuff. And they would sacrifice a whole lot to come back to a place after they were transformed and said, I need to be that transformed person on the island for the people that need it. I need to give some people some hope. And I honor that. Unfortunately, those people that did that were too few and far between. Majority of the people that came back to the island, it was a completely different experience. They went off the island, they went to Anchorage, Fairbanks, right? They went to these places, and as soon as life hit, as soon as there was hard, as soon as there was spiders in the bathroom, they didn't know who they were. It was unfamiliar. It was scary, right? You could have a teenager on the island that was like becoming the town drunk, who like never took responsibility for life, who was always struggling, goes to Anchorage, and you know what's going to happen? When life hits, when it gets hard, what are you going to do? You're going to do the exact same thing you did on the island, except for here's the problem, nobody knows you in Anchorage. You want to know how lonely you feel when you're tasting something that didn't satisfy before in a place where nobody even recognizes you? They go back to the thing that held them in bondage before, and then they literally turn around and go physically back to that city because in that city there's a familiar. And it's okay for you to be the town drunk because everybody knows you as the town drunk. You can live in that bondage for the rest of your life because you know what role to play, and everybody accepts that role of you. Do you hear what I'm saying? You go back to the bondage internally, and then you go back externally to the same circumstances. Does that make sense? And it wrecks my heart because it's like you'd see some of these people and you're like, everything inside of you longed for them to know purpose in their life. Everything inside of you longed for them to realize you were made for more than this and you are settling for the comfortable because it's familiar. The courage it would take to walk out of that into freedom physically, but then another step, freedom internally, is incredible, okay? Normally we break up into groups to pray, but like I got stuff I need to say. So we're going to say it. So what I'm going to do is everybody stand up. I want you guys to join me in a prayer. Those that need to send their kids downstairs, go ahead and send them down at any point in time. But I want us collectively, instead of breaking up in groups today, I invite you. This is not a mandate. This is a invitation, not an expectation. But if you are willing, I would love for you to pray this prayer with me today, and then we're just going to jump right into our sermon. Heavenly Father, help us behold you. Help us become more aware of your presence. Help us have eyes to see you and your goodness. Help us to hear your whispers of invitation in our life. Help us to do for you. Even more, help us to be with and rest with you. Help us to know your name. Help us to get free internally and externally from our Egypt. Help us have the courage to come into your presence. Help us lift our eyes to you. May your presence soften our hearts today. We ask these things in your name. Let it be so. Okay, we've been talking about Genesis and Exodus for quite some time. Literal years. All right, I'm going to give you this. I'm going to read it out loud, but I'm putting it in the slide for those that want slide stuff later. God adopts Israel from Egypt, frees them from bondage, protects them from harm, provides water, food, cool at day, and warmth at night in a desert, and promises space for them to call home to flourish. He even listens and gives goodness when his child grumbles and complains about it. He provides them laws to prove his intentions are good and not for harm. He calls them into rest in his presence. He invites them into being with him and the community. He actively is working to heal previous wounds and traumas. He proves to be faithful and trustworthy to a people, often not faithful back. He sustains his people by his presence, and the world watches for 40 years astonished. I want you to pause and think about this for a second. 40 years they're in the desert, right? 40 years. Is that a short amount of time? That is my lifetime, which is also still a short amount of time, right? Like it's a whisper to God, and yet that feels like a long sentence, 40 years, right? I want you to think about this for a second. A lot of times when I, as a child, grew up reading the Bible, I looked at it through this lens of like the Old Testament, we've got this angry God that is always demanding obedience to a bunch of people that can never be obedient, that always get punished, that get thrown back into the cycle over and over and over again, and like we can never live it up, and just to like rub it in, we got all of these old laws. It's like, man, nobody can live up to these laws. And the truth is, nobody can live up to these laws, right? It's all about sin and a need for obedience. And yet, we all have sinned. We have all fallen short, and yet we all can't be obedient, and yet we've got this striving that happens over and over again, and all of this stuff. And in the meantime, God is angry about it, and that's kind of how you feel. And then, oh, thank the good Lord that we've got Jesus who comes, and man, he's super kind, and he's over here doing miracles, and he's doing all these things, but we don't recognize that the God of the Old Testament is still the God of the New Testament. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen my Father. Man, that used to mess with me, and then I'd say, okay, God, there's all these stories that like I need to know, how were you good? Because this doesn't look super good, right? Like, there's all these stories in the desert, and you're like, man, you just took them out of Egypt where they're in slavery, they're in bondage, to throw them in the desert. Like, I understand why they're like, oh, man, you should have just killed us back over there. Like, are you kidding me? Like, 40 years in the desert, all we got is the same food and the same water every day over and over again. And, like, there's this grumbling that happens, and part of me is like, man, if God put me in a desert, that doesn't sound super awesome. Like, how many of you are like, sign me up for the desert for 40 years? That's a good gift. How many of you feel like, you know what, that feels like a punishment? Right? Does God want obedience? Yes. Let me be very, very clear. He wants obedience. But there's more to it than that. If you love me, you'll obey my commands. Sometimes we read that verse and say, if I'm obedient, it proves that I've loved him. You know what obedience is without love? Slavery. That's the thing he's trying to take them out of Egypt with. Right? That's obedience without love. But he says, you know what? If you love me, the byproduct of love is obedience. Right? We as parents, we want our kids to be obedient. Will I sacrifice the fact that, like, is obedience the only goal for me as a father? No. It would grieve me to my core if my kid was incredibly obedient to me the whole days of his life, her life, and they never knew me. They never loved me. Can you hear that? If my kids were completely obedient every second of their life to me, I would be so unfulfilled if they never knew my love and were able to reciprocate it. If my kids love me, they'll choose to obey me. And you know what? I understand that kids, They mess up sometimes. You know why I know that kids mess up sometimes? I was a kid. Also, I'm an adult and I still mess up sometimes. I'm human, right? Like, do you hear what I'm saying? I have some level of grace for my child who is immature. I have a level of grace for my child who is immature. My hope is as they mature and as they spend time in my presence, they get to know my heart, and they are moved by my heart to be like their dad. And because they want to be like their dad, they choose to love me. And because they choose to love me, there's an obedience that's just the overflow. Does that make sense? Ooh. Sin is a real thing. Disobedience is a real thing. They carry consequences, right? When my kids mess up, there's consequences to it. But the consequences don't change my heart after them, right? Can I be frustrated that they keep falling on their face? Sure. Can I be frustrated in the physical realm when my kid keeps falling off their bike? Absolutely. But never am I looking at my kids saying, you're never going to figure this out. You're not made to ride a bike. Some people are made to ride bikes and you're not. I think everybody can learn. Right? 40 years. Think about this for a second. 40 years. Best desert I can think of for a visual is the Sahara Desert. Everybody picture the Sahara Desert in their mind. Now I want you to picture what happens when you take 2 million people and you walk in dead center of the Sahara Desert. What's going to happen to them? They'll be thirsty, and then they'll dry up and die. We all on the same page? 2 million people, how long does it take for them to die in the Sahara Desert? Not long, right? We're talking days, right? Here you have this wild situation. Egypt is the most prominent nation of their time. And God comes in and he takes them out. And he's like, plague after plague after plague. He's slow playing like, hey, I've got all this power, but you need to know my presence. And like, I am different from all the other gods of the entire world. And he takes his people out of slavery and he brings them into a desert. And the whole world is watching. If this God can take them out of Egypt, what's about to happen? And they get stuck in the desert. Did they have to be stuck in the desert for 40 years? No. No, they didn't have to be. Right? They had an opportunity to go into the promised land pretty quickly. How many days would it have taken for them to get up to the promised land? Not many. Right? And yet it took them 40 years in a desert. And there's a whole bunch of things that they did, right, that weren't great. We're going to talk about some of those things and the purpose of them. And was there disobedience? Absolutely. Like we had talked this last week about all these things where God provided water. God provided manna for them daily, right? Pause for a second. You got 2 million people in the Sahara Desert. And then all of a sudden, they don't die, right? We talked a little bit about how this is like there's so many things about this that you can copy paste and you find the same chiastic pattern of Moses with the burning bush where he's staring at this burning bush that should burn up, that should actually be consumed, and it's not. And the chiastic pattern there shows like, hey, wait a second. These are like my brothers in Egypt that are enslaved that should be killed by now, but they're not. Like God is sustaining them. And then he takes them out, brings them in the desert, and these people should be dying off left and right, and yet they're not right away, right? Like there's these wild connections. Like think about this for a second. If you are the nations, if we had 2 million people in the Sahara Desert that God was sustaining for 40 years, how many of you guys are talking about it? At least once in 40 years. In 4 decades, do you know about that nation that's in the desert? Man, they've got some sort of God that's providing for them food every day, water every day. Man, they're in the middle of a desert, and yet there's this cloud that gives them shade. During the day when it's really hot, they've got cool. And at nighttime, they're not freezing because there's this like massive ball of fire over them that keeps them warm. You can even see. Isn't that wild? Like how many of you guys would have conversations about that at some point in time? And we wonder why the nations tremble when God moves them out of the desert. And they're like, oh my goodness, the God that can sustain and provide them every day like that, is coming to a town near me, I'm in trouble. Right? Who's blind of all of this stuff? You've got the Israelites that are blind, right? You've got the people that, man, God's like, hey, here's the deal. I want you to, you're going to send these spies into the land. I'm going to tell you right now, it's good. I've been promising it for generations. It's really good. It's filled with milk. It's got honey. It's got land for you. There's going to be a space for you to grow and multiply and have your family. It's going to be awesome. Hey, why don't you go check out how good it is? Come back with a report. They come back with a report, and they're like, man, this place is big. And it took 2 of us to carry out this grapevine. But there's giants in the land. And there's this and there's that. And all of their eyesight was on all the things that they were afraid of. What's the purpose of sending the spies if God knew that it was good and knew that he was going to give it to them? It's an invitation. Do you trust what I say? Do you trust that it's good because I said it's good? Do you trust that you're going to receive it because I said you're going to receive it? Or are you going to look at it and say, I don't have enough strength as a human being. I don't have enough strategy to take out these enemies. The invitation is to trust beyond what we can do with our own strength, with our own mind. And say, you know what? It's by his Spirit. It's by faith. It's by trust in the one who took us out of Egypt that he can take us into a promised land. Right? There's that invitation. And yet, in all of the spies, you know what they ended up saying? There was 10 bad, there was 2 good, and the 10 bad said all these things, and the people's response was fear. And what did they say? You know what's good? You know what's good? Going back to Egypt would be good. Going back to Egypt. That, you know what? I've looked at everything. God says it's good there. I would rather be enslaved. I would rather go back to my island in the Bering Sea and be the town drunk and be enslaved and be in bondage because I know that spot. I am familiar with being a slave. I know my old stomping grounds. I know where I could catch fish on the minutes where I wasn't getting beat. I would rather go back to Egypt than inherit the good. You guys hear that? Before we throw stones, man, there's so much inside of us where God is jealous for us. He wants us to be out of our Egypt. Things that we've been in bondage to, things that we've been enslaved to, might even be generationally, right? And he's saying, I've got more for you. I want you to be free, not just physically free from your circumstances, but internally I want you to be alive. I want you to be free on the inside, right? And he's inviting us into that stuff. Man, you want to know some of the purpose of some of these stories, right? Purpose of the plagues. He's revealing himself as the creator and the father, right? A God who is a father. Man. Purpose of the training wheel laws. We talked about the laws of like, hey, you know what? There's the manna in the morning, every morning. Whether you pick for 24 hours or whether you pick for 24 seconds when you get back to your tent, you all have 1 omer. Just try to break that. You want to do it 18 hours in the day, you want to pick manna, guess what? You're still coming home with the same amount as that one person that spent 5 seconds. I would love to think someone in the 40 years that they were there put together that, wait a second, every day this manna exists, and regardless if I spend a lot of time or a little time getting manna, I come home with the same amount of manna. How little can I pick? Right? How many of you guys are like, you know what? At some point in the 40 years, I'd be like, I'm going to try to pick less. I want to see if there's going to be the same amount when I get back. Am I the only one that's like that? Right? Or are you going to, for 40 years, rely on your own strength of going out there and picking as much as you can and coming back home because that's the only work you've got? Right? Now, because the spies said we would rather be back in Egypt, it grieved God and said, you're not going to inherit. This is not the right heart. You guys are missing out on this. Your kids who do not yet know right from wrong, good from evil, they'll inherit the land. Right? Where have we heard right from wrong, good from evil? The garden. someday, I don't know if it'll be in church or some side group, we're going to look at the details and you will be astonished at the number of things that are Bible references where they're trying to come into the promised land that'll go all the way back to the Garden of Eden days. It is astonishing when you see it and you recognize, wait a second, God is trying to invite them back into this intimate presence in the garden-like thing in the promised land. Like, there's this invitation back. He wants to restore, he wants to reconcile, he wants to have a relationship, and it's like all these areas that it took me literal decades to be able to see, and I thank the good Lord that he's helping me see those things, right? It's not by my own strength. But when you start seeing those things, you're like, oh my goodness, he's trying to draw them back into the garden. He's trying to draw them back into intimacy, right? He started in Genesis, and he created this space for man, said, fill it. And like everything that's happening in this time period is he's like, hey, would you create a space so I can fill it? Like, what do you think the tabernacle is about? His presence comes down, and he's like, here's the space that I can fill. I want to be one with you. I want to be close with you. Anyways, his purpose of training wheel laws is to show he's the father who gives, not a God who demands. Pharaoh always demanded more. I need more. I'm the big king. I'm the big Pharaoh. I need you to do work for me. I need you to produce for me. And God's like, hey, actually, you know what? I'm a father. Instead of me needing you to produce for me, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give you those things. A father hears his child's grumblings and still chooses good. An angry God doesn't respond to that. Purpose of the staff, right? You take an instrument that was of bondage, of beating, and turn it into an instrument of provision where they see, when they use the staff, it brings water. Oh, you know what? We get attacked by another army in the middle of the desert. Well, if we look up, that rod, it's there to comfort, protect us, because when the rod is up, God provides victory. Okay, God can provide. Oh, man, okay. To reveal that the victory is won with trust in him, not in man's strength or our strategies. Purpose of the clean and unclean laws. It goes into all these details of these clean laws and unclean laws and these weird things that sound honestly like witchcraft. You're like, well, if this person is unclean, you kick them out of the community. And what they need to do is they need to get this branch and they dip it into some hyssop and some blood. And you take that blood and you have to take these two birds and you kill one of the birds and you spatter blood on both of them and you set one of them free and then you kill the other. Like, you're like, what is going on? This sounds crazy. And yet every part of the clean, unclean business is that there are things in life that make you unclean. Does sin make you unclean? Yes. Can you be unclean without sinning? Also, yes. Right? And so this is not just about when I've sinned, I get kicked out of the community until I do these weird sacrifices and things. Does that make sense? The sacrifices are to take them back and help them remember. Remember when we got taken out of Egypt? We had to put the blood on the door. And all the sacrifice stuff brings you back. But everything with the clean and unclean, it was for you to get to a place where if you were unclean, you had to go outside of the camp and meet your Maker. You had to go and face mortality with the one who is immortal. Everything about it was to get into his presence and say, oh my goodness, I screwed up, I've got this thing and that. The only thing that can make me clean is being in your presence. And to get in your presence, I do these steps, I do these things because it helps me remember to be reborn by faith and not just by doing things on my own strength, because I didn't get out of Egypt on my own. Does that make sense? The invitation to come into his presence and become one with him in a way that cleans and purifies us. The purpose of the tablets of testimony, to show a father bent on faithfulness, even to a people unfaithful. They testify of his love, not our shame. We talked about this in one of those sermons. Moses goes up on the mountain. You've got everybody like, you can't touch the mountain. There's just this holiness that's there. And yet God brings Moses up there, and he speaks to the people. Everybody is hearing him talk. Remember? Like, what an intimate, mind-boggling thing that an entire community is hearing the audible voice of God in the presence of God at the bottom of the mountain. And during this time, it's wild. God is saying, hey, all these things, and they're coming into this covenant with him, right? And they're doing all this stuff, and they're like, yes, whatever he's saying, we're all about this. And God is with his finger inscribing in stone these 10 commandments. And he comes on down the hill, And what does he find? The golden calf. Like, this is a covenant with God and mankind. Right? When we think of covenants, we think of marriage, right? Until death do us part, until one of us dies. Right? This is like a marriage compact, and like you're about to get married to the one that you love, your beloved, and here you've got coming down the aisle, and they're off with what? A golden calf? Like, this was 12 seconds ago, and you're already making a god by your own hands, and you're saying, Moses, whatever you do, tell him not to talk to us. You listen to him. Tell me. We have been in Genesis and Exodus for literal years. Literal years. I'm not going to do this. But if I had you stand, if you have not yet read Genesis and Exodus in the last 3 years, we probably would have more people than you would think. Am I saying this to shame you? No. No. It is the exact same thing that God feels. There's a longing inside of him that says, I want to talk to my people, and if they would only open their ears and open their eyes and see me, I want to share a fresh revelation with them. Do they have the courage to listen to my voice, or are they only hoping to get the scraps via the pastor or whoever's coming up here in the 5-minute thing? Do you hear what I'm saying? He is a jealous God, it says, right? I am a jealous God. Is he jealous of the golden calf? Is the golden calf anywhere near comparable to God? No. He is jealous for his kid. He is jealous that they would know his presence. He was jealous that they would know freedom. He's jealous that they would leave Egypt on the outside and leave Egypt on the inside. He's jealous that they would know their identity. He's jealous that they would hear his voice. He's jealous that they would see him physically right there in their presence for 40 years. He's like, I want you to know me, and I want you to come in contact with me. I want you to know what's on my heart. I want you to hear the goodness that I have. I want you to hear that I want you to be a kingdom of priests, to be a blessing for the entire world. I want to hook you up with blessings for the entire world. I want to free you from your bondage. I want to free you from your slavery. I want to free you from the familiar. I want to free you from these things, and I am jealous for you to become the one I designed you in your mother's womb. I had hopes and dreams for who you would become. Do you have the courage to let me make you that? And the very first chance that they come in contact with his presence and they say, let's make our own God. Maybe, just maybe, there's a comfortability that we have this illusion of control in our lives. Purpose of sending the spies, see if they believe that it was good and theirs because God said it was, or they rely on their own eyes, their own assessment of their fears. Let's look at some more of the things. Purpose of the snakes. How many of you guys think about the snakes, right? They're grumbling, they're complaining, they're doing all these things, and God, it says, sends the snakes after them. And they go, and all these snakes start biting the people, and they start dying, and God's like, all right, Moses, what I want you to do is I want you to take a staff, and I want you to put a bronze snake on the top, and anybody that lifts their eyes at it, they're going to be healed. Is it the staff and the snake that heal them? No, it's when they take their eyes off the thing they fear most and trust the one who can heal them, right? Now, there's a whole lot more layers to this Nehushtan, and it it grieves me, and I only have the small taste of how much it must grieve him. But for generations, they kept that staff into the promised land and beyond and into their kingship. And they would put it outside the temple, and they would worship that staff without knowing the source of power behind it. Right? If God has freed you from things, we don't worship the thing that freed you. We worship the source of life behind it. Right? It's the same thing as a cross. If we worship a cross, the cross didn't free you. Jesus on the cross, but you know what? The story doesn't end on a cross. If he ends up just dead, we're all in trouble. Right? Because he ends up dying, but he ends up being resurrected, and he comes back, and there's an empty tomb, right? There's more to the story. The snakes. The Hebrew tells a little bit different story with the snakes. It's not that God is sending the snakes after them. It's that it's like he withholds the protection that he's always had. All right? How many of you guys, if you're in a desert and there's a lot of snakes, how many of you think that some point in the 40 years somebody's getting bit by a snake and you're dying? Quite a bit. Right? These snakes are on rocks and crevices and everything else. Part of what they couldn't understand is God had already been protecting them. I bet you none of them were saying, God, can you please protect us from the snakes? He was already protecting them from the snakes. Like everywhere they went, the snakes weren't biting. And he's like, you know what? You want me to like withhold my covering? Let me show you what withholding my covering looks like. And then they all started dying. And they're like, whoa, we need that covering back. All right, purpose of the tabernacle, to reveal that God and man can unify in a way that provides life and not just death. There's this situation that happens, right? Moses is up there. You've got you got a couple sons of the Levites that are up there, of Aaron's sons, and they're close to when God is having this like magnificent revelation with Moses. And Moses has all these plans, and God gives all these plans to Bezalel and Holiab, which are like awesome people, some of my favorites in the Bible, of how to make the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and all of this information, right? And so these people have this like encounter with God, and it takes them like a year to make this thing, and they make it all, and when they're doing that, that cloud that had descended on the mountain, and Moses had survived, like the same things happen, copy, paste again, and those same things are happening, and literally the presence of God comes down on the Holy of Holies, and like there is just this wild outburst of like people rejoicing that God has filled this place that God had designed for them to create. Does that make sense? Like there's this presence of God, and you got these two sons, and what the two sons do is they grab their incense and they run in to the Holy of Holies, and they create their incense. Incense in, how many people have been around incense? Okay, when you burn incense, what happens? You can smell it. Can you see it? Okay, you see it as smoke. What direction does the smoke go? Okay, so you've got a smoke that goes up and a cloud of smoke that's coming down of God's presence. When smoke mixes, what happens? Can you tell the difference between one smoke and another smoke? If I took dry ice and incense, and it wouldn't take us long before they would mix and match, right? Does that make sense? You guys with me? These guys, though, they jumped the gun. They said, man, I see that there's this thing and I want it. I remember Moses going up and being in the presence of God, and I want to be connected to God, and I'm going to rush in on my own strength and my own strategies, and I'm going to go and do this thing. Have we had a story in the Bible where somebody had a desire for something that wasn't theirs to take, and they took it, and death entered the world? Well, the same thing's happening here. These guys are rushing in, and they take of it. They take this strange incense in, and they die. Right? There's this wild stuff, and you're like, wait, then getting in God's presence is going to bring death. It's either going to bring death or it's going to bring life. Right? He is the one that holds both life and death. And God's saying, hey, listen, I recognize that you want to be in my presence, so hey, this is how you do it. This is when you do it. Once a year, we're going to do this thing, and once a year, your high priest is going to come on in. And once a year, I'm going to forgive all of the sins for the entire nation. And once a year, we're going to have these things, and I'm going to invite you into my presence, because there's going to be a time where these smokes can mix, and on behalf of the entire nation's sacrifices and their prayers and their incense, my cloud is going to come in with your cloud, and there's going to be a oneness. Can you guys see that for a second? If we were to look at that passage, if you look at it closely, right, in this atonement stuff, you would think that the point of this whole thing is to forgive sins, right? And yet, if you look at that chapter, it's the last thing that he says. It's kind of like an afterthought. And by the way, when we do this thing, it forgives sins. God, give us eyes to see and ears to hear. there is sin in this world. I've sinned, you've sinned, we've all sinned. There's a God that can forgive sin, right? Is the point of our existence to be forgiven of sin? No. I am so thankful that God put that as an afterthought at the end of the chapter. He says, no, here's the deal. I want to become one with you in our smokes mix. The things that are unclean become clean when it comes into my presence. The point is intimacy. The byproduct of intimacy with his presence, one of those things is forgiveness. The goal isn't forgiveness, the goal is intimacy. Do you guys hear that? Our big story is not about how do we get forgiven. Our big story is how to become one with the Creator. Right? If you are trying to live a life just out of obedience, it's not going to be enough. Obedience doesn't prove love. You on your own strength cannot produce any fruit that's good. None. It's not about you with your obedience, all of the good that you can do, and bring that as an offering to him. Everything about life is saying, God, can you graft me into a tree? And because you're the source and I'm connected to you, the byproduct of me being connected to you is good fruit comes. Right? And the most fruit in a tree comes with a tree that is at rest. The work is done at rest. God created 6 days, and the seventh day he rested. Did he rest because he was tired? No, he rested because you do these things so that you can be. We are not human doings, we're human beings. Sometimes we do the things we do so we can pause and be with him. Right? God's like, hey, there's a rhythm to being with me. Purpose of the two-goat atonement sacrifice. One receives death so that all that deserve death can be set free into life. There's a whole lot more to that one. We'll jump into another day. Purpose of the laws. How to turn slaves into daughters, how to restore family, how to take care of the outsider, because you remember what it was like to be a slave. How to minister to each other and the nations, how to have a heart like our Father. The laws are to reveal his heart. The purpose of the covenant of Sinai. It's an invitation into death, to face mortality and the one who holds life and death in his hand. It's a promise of a future invitation into life, to face immortality with the one who wants to give life abundant. Going back a little bit, Moses comes down the mountain, sees that they made this golden calf, and he throws the 2 tablets of testimony on the ground and breaks them, right? If you look closely, and we can talk about this another day, we did this in another sermon, but I believe that those broken tablets are the ones that are in the tabernacle, that are in that spot as testimony. Is it because God forever wants them to know, listen, I want you to know the shame of when I was going to marry you and you were cheating me down on the aisle? You know what I'm saying? Like, is he trying to add shame to people? Is he trying to say, look at how unfaithful you are? He's saying, look, in the worst of situations, even when you're incredibly unfaithful, I will still remain faithful. It's a promise of God's faithfulness. It's not to always remind us of our own unfaithfulness. The older generation that was in the desert, they weren't able to enter the promised land. And that is unfortunate, right? 40 years they were in the desert wandering. If you knew that, you know what, I'm not going to enter the promised land, God has spoken it, I'm going to be in this desert for 4 decades for the rest of my life, how many of you guys would be like, I'm out? If I'm never going to taste of the promised land, I'm out. This is a terrible punishment. I can't believe I never made it. Right? I want you to see how beautiful of a gift even that was. Right? Think about this for a second. How many of you would quit your job if you knew that like God would provide every meal for you and your family, the water you needed, and all you had was time on your hand to spend in community with the people around you and in God's presence for the rest of your life? Is that not a good gift? Some of the names for that area are Desert of Paran, the Desert of Glory. To sit in his glorified presence for the rest of your life, not having to make a single thing on your own. Like, who would sign up for that? You hear what I'm saying? The goal is intimacy. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to pause everything you're doing as a nation, and I'm going to reveal my presence to you. Your kids, all they're going to know is that I provide everything they've ever needed every day of their life. And because all that they know is that I'm a God that provides, they will trust me when I bring them into the new land filled with giants. They will trust me that because I say it's going to be theirs, it's going to be theirs. Right? He wants to give an inheritance. But we as children, we don't go and steal our inheritance from our parents. Right? He's saying, listen, I want you to behold my presence. I want you to be in relationship with me. And out of relationship, the byproduct, I'll give you inheritance. The land, the promised land, was a byproduct of them learning. Did everybody make it in? No. There's a whole generation that died off in the wilderness still complaining, I wish I had fresh bread in Egypt. There's more I want to say, but I'll hop into some reflections quick. It's a big page, sorry. 1, how long will it take to get the Egypt out of you? Is it going to take days or decades? The good news is whether you get stuck in an Egypt, if you get stuck in a desert place of your life, he still wants to be intimate with you. But there's more that he wants to give you. 2, when you have his presence, you lack nothing. Is your eyesight on what you think you lack or on the one who provides what you need? 3, even the desert is a beautiful gift. Will you recognize the intimacy offered in the desert season, or will you just long for the things that didn't satisfy before? 4, can you behold him and wait to receive from him, or are you going to try to take from him the first chance you get? 5, tablets of testimony. Focus isn't on the sin, shame of the people, but rather the grace, goodness, and faithfulness of a father. 6, we work so that we can be. We are designed to be human beings instead of human doings. Can you embrace more being with your Creator and community? 7, inheritance is given. It's not taken. 8, he isn't jealous of your idols. He knows that they don't compare. He is jealous for you. Are you going to choose him or the garbage? Heavenly Father, I just ask that you would give us eyes to see you, give us ears to hear you, give us a heart that is soft towards you. God, I am thankful that you're not angry with us. God, I recognize that there's a lot of times that we mess up, that we disappoint, and we frustrate you. I recognize that sometimes we fall. But I'm so thankful that you're always there to pick us up. God, I believe that you are inviting this church, this nation, this world to shift. God, help us catch the whisper. God, help us hear your voice. Help us see what you're doing. God, I ask that you would help us learn how to be with you, how to become one with you, how to be grafted into you. God, we acknowledge that we can't produce any good fruit on our own. We acknowledge that any good fruit is a byproduct of being connected to you. God, we acknowledge that any sin that we have, any shortfalls, God, that when we come in your presence, you're the one that purifies us. I'm thankful that you sent your son. Man, and the things that in their day and age that would have made him unclean, he reversed the tables. Instead, he made the unclean clean with the things that he touched and the people that he touched. God, help us to be more like that. Jesus, your prayer was that we would become one like you are one. Your desire was not just to forgive sins, but to invite us into intimacy with the Father. Man, may we know that intimacy. Yahweh, I accept that invitation today. Help me know you intimately. God, help us walk out of our Egypts and help us relinquish the Egypt that's inside of us. God, help us behold your presence. Help us see your presence around us. And help us to wait on you for whatever inheritance you want to give us. God, whatever inheritance you give us, may it be so that we can freely receive and freely give. May we be the thing that you had desired from the start, a blessing to the nations, a blessing to our family, a blessing to our community, a blessing back to you. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I think I want to do something again a little bit different than normal. I'm going to invite people to come on up. If that's your heart too today, if you're at a place where you say, you know what? Man, God, I want to be one with you. I want to be intimate. And like, can you forgive anything that I need forgiven? And give him some time to bring anything up in your head that you need. And lay it at his feet. But like, can we walk out of this church different? Can we come into his presence in a way that says, you know what? I connected with my Creator in a way that purifies me, that connects with him. If you're at a spot today where you're like, you know what? I want to remember what Jesus has done for me on the cross, which was more than just forgive sins, but also to invite me into oneness. Say, I accept that oneness with you. Father, help me. Help me see you. Help me hear you. Help me love like you. Help me receive your love. Help me receive your grace. Help me receive your kindness, and help me give all of those things out to the people around me. If that's you today, I'm just going to ask you to come on up by yourself and just grab one. Take it back. We do this as a new covenant, as a remembrance of God's covenant, right? Jesus said, hey, you know what? I'm giving you a covenant of my blood. Right? We had a covenant of death that helped us face our mortality with the one who was immortal. And Jesus says, hey, you know what? I'm going to bring my death, and I'm actually going to invite you to be one with the immortal, my Father. So if that's you, come and grab one. I'm going to have just a couple minutes of just silence for you guys to sit with God, and then Randy, when it's time, you want to just start playing again. If you need prayer today when church is done, or even whenever, come sit in one of these front rows and somebody come pray with you. But the middle rows are gluten-free if anybody's gluten-free. But go ahead whenever you're ready. Come join me.
Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord, late in time, behold him come, offspring of the Virgin's womb, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Hail the hand-born Prince of Peace, hail the Son of Righteousness, light and life to all he brings, risen with healing in his wings. Mild he laid his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. And mild he lays his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise the sons of earth, born to give them second birth. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
You're welcome to go in peace or stay in peace.